On October 26, 1960, Soviet newspapers had released details about an aircraft crash that had claimed the life of Mitrofan Nedelin, the then Marshal of artillery for the Soviet Union. The funny thing was, however, they lied. Not about Mitrofan being dead, but how he died. There had been no aircraft crash. There had been no crash at all. The cover-up of what had caused his death would end up lasting decades. But slowly, piece by piece, information about what had really happened to Nedelin slowly started to come to the surface. And when the full picture would finally be put together, it would tell a horrific story of some of the most dangerous materials on Earth, incredible disregard for safety, and a cover-up, almost on par with the size of the explosion that killed him. Baikonur Cosmodrome had been home to Soviet launch and missile testing operations for, well, forever. And after the end of the Second World War, it was being put to good use in order to aid in the development of things that would be, for instance, pointed to space, but also pointed at the West. On this particular occasion, though, it was being used to develop a prototype of the R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile. A missile 30 meters high, 3 meters in width, and weighing over 140 tons once it was fully fueled. But the size of the rocket wasn't going to be the problem here. It's the fact that it was filled to the brim with devil's venom, a very apt name for dimethylhydrazine and nitric acid. These were used as fuel due to their high boiling temperature, meaning that they could sit and not evaporate away like other, more safe fuels. However, the fuels weren't completely safe. They were known as hypergolic. This meant that they didn't even need a source of ignition in order to, well, ignite. Once they exposed to each other, they would simply go boom all by themselves. And when you added to this their incredible toxicity, they proved to be some of the most dangerous forms of rocket fuel on Earth. Leading the exercise, Mitrofan Nedelin had been a long-term veteran of the Red Army, even gaining the Hero of the Soviet Union award for his service during World War II. And he had been put in charge of the Soviet ballistic missile program and had been appointed the first commander of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces in 1959. And by this point, he had served in his role for almost a year before what was about to happen on the 24th of October, 1960. It would be 8 a.m. on October 21st that the R-16 would be placed on the pad at Baikonure. Then began a long process of checks, readying the rocket for fueling and also its eventual launch. However, the crew and Nedelin himself was eager to get a launch off the ground before November 7th. This date signifying the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. This pressure to launch ultimately led to pre-launch tests overlapping with the actual launch operations. Not a great combination when you're dealing with some of the most dangerous and toxic fuels on planet Earth. Incredibly though, and without apparent issue, all checks were completed by October 23rd. So then the only thing left to do was to fuel the rocket with the nitric acid and the dimethylhydrazine, and then launch it. I really can't understate how important of a point in time the fueling of the rocket was. Once that fuel was loaded, there was no procedure in place to remove it safely. Either the rocket was going to go flying, or it was going to go boom. On the 24th, the engineers at the site were being put under severe pressure to get the rocket flying. So much so that Nedelin himself, after enduring several 30-minute delays, decided himself to head to the launch pad and to try to speed things up. After everything had happened and the dust had settled, some would say his actions to go to the pad were due to his dedication to the cause, while others would say that his approach did nothing but slow and frustrate those already working on the rocket. Either way, he would now be positioned, sitting no less than 20 meters from the rocket itself, fully loaded with fuel, while commission members who had come to see the launch had followed him to the launch pad in a coach, and were sitting not all that further away. The constant testing upon testing had meant that the programming current distributor, the device that activates onboard systems in a certain sequence, had been left on a post-launch position. And by the time it was discovered, the onboard batteries had been fully powered up. This, alongside other tests leaving other parts of the rocket circuits and valves online and open, meant that the second stage engine was now only one valve away from releasing the self-igniting hypergolic fuels into the combustion chamber and causing an almighty explosion. Then, at around 1845 local time, the final, fatal decision was taken, and it was in the form of a question. Should I move the PTR to 0? And go ahead with the response. As the switch was moving to the 0 position, it had the nasty side effect of activating that single valve that had been the only thing stopping the second stage engine from igniting. Instantly, the engine came to life, and flames ripped through the fully prepared fuel tank of the first stage below, leading to an incredible explosion at the pad, engulfing all those working there and around it in incredibly toxic fuels that just a few moments ago were inside the rocket. Immediately, the flames had engulfed all those at the pad. Those that did have the option of running away on the ground would find it very difficult. Fresh tar had just been laid down, which was now in the process of melting, making escape borderline impossible. These weren't the only horrific ways to die, though. Those who had managed to escape the flames and the tar, sadly, weren't going to be able to get beyond the surrounding fence at the pad, and had no other option but to dive into the wells plotted around the launch complex. But they would end up being killed by the incredibly toxic fumes released from the rocket's hypergolic fuels. Perhaps the worst way to die of all. The explosions had only lasted around 20 seconds, but the fire would end up lasting almost 2 hours. The flashes of light from the explosions were being seen from as far away as 50 kilometers. Before long, buses after buses of those injured would start to arrive at a nearby hospital. However, attempts at trying to treat the survivors would be hampered by the delay in informing the doctors treating the injured just what type of fuel has caused such serious damage to the bodies of those who managed to make it out. Of the 49 survivors that would eventually make it to hospital, only 33 would still be alive several months later. After the explosion, the rescue attempts and all the flames had finally died down and been extinguished for the final time. The only thing really left to do was to find the cause and apply blame. During final preparations for the launch, a fire took place, which caused the destruction of the tanks with components of the propellant. As a result of the accident, there are casualties numbering up to 100 or more people, including fatalities, several dozen people. Chief Marshal of Artillery Nedelin was present at the test site. Now, the search for him is ongoing. That was a message sent by Deputy Yangel to the Kremlin on the 24th of October. That same night, a team had been sent to the site to investigate just what had happened to the rocket. In conclusion, they found that the management of testing was overly confident about the safe operation of the rocket. They simply thought nothing bad would happen. The fire on the vehicle could have been avoided if the reconfiguration of the current distributor into a 0 position was conducted before the activation of the onboard power supply. In the future, it was recommended to conduct further tests of the flight control systems on board the R-16. The investigation in total would only last 10 to 15 days. Then the order to rebuild the damaged test site and begin testing once again of the R-16 was given. In total, the number of dead would rise to 92 when all was said and done, with 84 soldiers being buried in a mass grave in a nearby area called Soldiers Park. The civilians that did die in the incident had their bodies shipped back to their hometowns to be buried by their families. But due to the secrecy needed at the time, they were forced to maintain that the reason for their loved ones' deaths had been an aircraft crash. The same story that would pop up in Soviet newspapers in October 1960, explaining the death of Mitrofan Nedelin. The Nedelin Catastrophe shows that you can't outplay the need for proper testing and safety, as every single safety measure skipped and tests shoved together will eventually extract a certain cost for doing so, as those working on the R-16 that day sadly discovered. May they rest in peace.